Hey, welcome to Modern Day Debate. Very excited to have you here. Today we are debating creation evolution, and we're starting right now. Hey, everybody, stoked to have you here. So, we have two experienced debaters here. They are here to debate creation evolution. As mentioned, their links are in the description. Please check out their links because, hey, even if you don't agree, hey, you at least got to hear them in the most charitable way possible, straight from them, rather than a summary from somebody else, right? So, I'm going to do the introductions, then we'll get into the debate. First, I will introduce our debaters, and then I will introduce our moderator, the co-mod. Thanks for being here, Siv. Glad to have you. Then,
Glad to be here.
thank you very much. Yeah, it's going to be a blast. So, starting off with Standing for Truth. He has been here a number of times. We're glad to have you back. Standing for Truth, what is going on at your channel?
Well, thanks for having me on again, James. It's always a good time. I think tonight's going to be a blast. This doubleheader thing is awesome. The usual stuff on my channel, discussions, trying to upload clips. Hopefully that'll interest people. Lots more discussions, hopefully debate, hangouts to come. So anyone who's interested, I'm more than happy, hoping that you come check it out. Thanks, James.
My pleasure, you betcha. And Godless Galaxy, your first time here, man. We're excited to have you. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so what's going on over your channel?
I don't know exactly what I'm going to do with my channel, but I hope soon that I can probably get some good software and maybe actually like put videos up and not wait like a month to put up something.
You bet. Right on, man. Well, we're glad you're here. And last but certainly not least, last time she was a total lifesaver, and I'm sure she'll be super helpful tonight. Last time we had like these like buffering problems, and then we had like a number of problems, and I was like, Siv, can you help like field the questions while I try to figure this out, like Google how to take care of this? So Siv, we definitely appreciate your help. Glad you're here. By the way, I'm putting Siv's Twitter down in the description right now. Sorry I'm late on that. Thanks for your patience. Siv, how you doing? How's it going?
I'm doing good. I'm excited to be here for this and listen to what they have to say.
Yeah, me too. Well, thanks. I'm glad. So, with that, we will get started. I have the clock set for 12 minutes, and the debaters discussed prior that Godless Galaxy will actually start. So, we're mixing things up, and the atheist guest will be going first this time. And so, Godless Galaxy, if you happen to have slides that you want to use, just let me know, and we'll bring them up. Otherwise, I am setting the clock, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. I don't have any fancy slides. I just kind of wrote down my intro or whatever. But thank you for having me. I was sick the first time we tried to set up this debate, but now I'm feeling much better. So this is how, and this is my, whatever. I know that Standing for Truth will be arguing possibly for genetic entropy to say that it disproves evolution. I agree that genetic entropy is happening, but I do disagree that it proves a young Earth. Genetic entropy, in my own words, would probably be natural selection and beneficial mutations can't keep up with the negative mutations affecting a genome. But as far as I know, as through my research, that this argument only shows humans as evidence of genetic entropy happening and as evidence for the young Earth, and no other animals as far as I have seen. I am not a geneticist, but I think the reason for the build-up, Standing for Truth will make his argument about this. But in the human genome, negative genes are built up, but I think this is partially due to the fact that humans have developed technology and medicine, which has, in result, slowed down natural selection and many other other ways of selection. With that, because of slowed down natural selection, getting rid of negative mutations are much harder, which results into negative effects like genetic diseases. We clearly genetic diseases are seen in humans, and I do not deny that that is happening. we can see a correlation that as human civilization advances with technology and medicine, so does the negative mutations. But this doesn't show that the Earth is young, as we have many other pieces of evidence that show that the Earth is old and that genetics just itself can't just disprove evolution. I would like, if someone could show me possibly a genome similar to ours showing that genetic entropy happens with other genomes, like cats or dogs, exactly. Probably not dogs because of artificial selection. But going on with that genetic stuff, it doesn't involve genetic entropy, but it involves genetics for us. Evolution, birds have silent genes in them that can build teeth. And we have tested this by having certain mice genes that activate this, which has shown that the bird embryos can grow dental structures. And this is clear evidence that birds are descended from dinosaurs, because why would birds need teeth, as we have never seen any birds with any teeth except transitions from dinosaurs to birds. I don't understand how a biblical creation could explain how birds have the genetic information to build teeth. I don't know. That was basically a much introduction. I didn't expect it to be 12 minutes long. I don't know exactly how long it was. How long has it been?
No problem. Well, I mean, it's optional. So you really just take as much as you need to. And if you feel like, hey, like that's my case, then I think it's better to go short and sweet, or like short and compact arguments, like strong arguments, rather than having to necessarily fill the full minutes. So, or the full 12 minutes. So that was actually excellent. And so basically you're down to about 7 minutes left, but as mentioned, you don't have to use them. I would stick with like the strongest arguments, and like the empirical data in psychology also suggests if you can take 3 solid arguments rather than taking like 3 good arguments plus like 3 solid arguments plus some like decent arguments, you're best off taking just 3 solid arguments. So with that, we will now move on to, if you want, you still got 7 minutes left. Otherwise, we can move on to standing for truth.
I would just actually have something. It won't take a minute.
For sure.
But, yeah. So the fossil record shows, I know I've said this in a previous debate, it shows simple life. I would just actually have too complex. And then standing for truth would say something about how that shows the fossil record. But the fossil record clearly shows that what evolution says that should have been seen. So it shows cells slowly evolving to fish or creatures that can survive in the sea. And then eventually these fish will be able to go on land. And then there will be a split between reptiles and mammals. And in the fossil record, we don't see any mammals with any fish or anything like that until later on, when mammals do adapt to ocean-like climates, or to the ocean. But my point is, we see dinosaurs and small mammals appearing, and then after the extinction of dinosaurs, not completely all the dinosaurs extinct, but we see all these bird-like fossils showing up a little bit before they go extinct. And then we see bird fossils with a mix of every other kind of animal that exists now. But it shows, the fossil record shows what steps were needed to get to here for like birds, reptiles, mammals, and many other animals today, with evidence from the fossil record. And that's it.
You got it. Well, thank you very much. And so that's excellent, very articulate and clear. And so we appreciate it, Godless Galaxy. And with that, I am going to now unmute Standing for Truth, who sounded as if he was like stamping postcards in the background. I don't know if anybody else could hear it. Standing for truth, I could hear it. I started to crack a smile. So I forgive me for forgetting to hit the mute button. I'm gonna try to remember to mute anybody. It's not just Standing for Truth.
I'm just mailing postcards to all my distant relatives.
So whatever you're doing over there, we're glad you're here Standing for Truth, and we're glad both of you are here. I'm resetting the clock, and so
I just wanted to actually clarify. I seen in the chat some people were complaining of an echo. Is the sound okay now?
It sounds good to me. Let me just quick check.
Just to make sure they can hear us.
I know
well
someone mentioned a fan. It sounded like a fan was on. I'll check on that. I'm going to double check because I know that there was an echo at the very start because I didn't have my headphones in. Sorry about that. So with that, we are starting you up. So Standing for Truth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, James. I'm just going to share my screen here and just let me see. Just figuring out how to do it with this program. So screen. Let me know if you can see my PowerPoint.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So thank you so much, Godless Galaxy, for joining in on this debate, origins debate, creation versus evolution. At the end of the day, it comes down to testable predictions. If we look here at the actual experimental data, we can when it comes to the DNA language, we have very little experimental data that can conclusively tell us what's functional and what's actually not functional. Now, if we go to the number of DNA differences and see what they show, not the pattern or the function, I'm just going to move this, but how many differences actually separate, say, me from you, us from the primates, et cetera. Two compartments that we look at. We got the mitochondrial DNA and the nuclear DNA. Now, the nuclear DNA has less than 17,000 DNA letters, and we know that they're inherited maternally. Now, due to copying errors, we can actually compare two DNA sequences next to each other. So this is what's important in figuring out this model. The time scale, on the other hand, it comes in when we compare the number of DNA differences. Evolutionists, based on their worldview and their assumptions, would say that all DNA differences ultimately are the result of mutation, aka this process of mistakes, and that the number of differences between these two species, particularly at the mitochondrial level, is a product of the time scale, or when they last shared a common ancestor. Now, there's been many studies, over 15. Mutation rates in humans is approximately 1 to 5 or 8 generations. We need to make assumptions, though, as to when women reproduce, and therefore calculations, predictions are made. Now, what are the results? If all women were ages 50 in the human lineage and all chimpanzee ancestors were ages 50 in the chimp lineage, there would be a minimum of 28,000 differences predicted between these two species. And if all women were ages 15 over the past 6 million years, you would have over 350,000 differences. Now, what we actually see in regards to the number of differences between these two species is just 1,400. So if you look at the model here, the actual number is 1,400. Evolutionists have over-predicted this. The biblical creation has the testable and falsifiable predictions. Now, it's too close for comfort for evolutionists because, for example, this data here on the slide, it's not disputed by evolutionists, and yet this evidence is 100% consistent based on young Earth creation predictions under a literal interpretation of Genesis. The question for evolutionists is, why is the known genetic data so consistent with a biblical-based model? It's far too close for comfort for the evolutionists. Biblical Adam and Eve predictions, for example, low genetic diversity, 1 Y chromosome, the male with the ancestor, 1 mitochondrial DNA, female ancestor, and most genes actually come in 2 versions. Now, Noah's flood predictions, all people are closely related. There's only a few mitochondrial DNA lines, the 1 Y chromosome line, and evidence of rapid population growth.
So when we look at genetics, bones found in the dirt, they're not inherited, traits are. Genetics confirms the biblical model. Now, it's widely known that human mitochondrial DNA differences divide into 3 major groups designated L, M, and N. You can see this in the graph that I have presented. These are the 3 major haplogroups. The history of humanity is in our genome. What we know about the mitochondrial DNA of humans fits the biblical base model. The model explains the 3 haplogroups and the relative differences between pre- and post-flood humanity. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited, as I said earlier, exclusively from mothers. There were 3 young women on the ark who would have repopulated the earth after the flood 4,500 years ago. The fact that there are 3 major haplogroups of human mitochondrial DNA in the world is amazing confirmation of this model. Also very consistent is the Babel dispersion, where one would expect sudden formation of several variants in human mitochondrial DNA due to rapid separation and isolation of various groups of people. Now, on this tree and map of humanity, the 3 major haplogroups are actually joined by relatively short line segments, as you can see here, indicating that there is not much difference between them. This is consistent with the pre-flood world of only 10 generations, long ages being that there were little differences between them. These women came from a world where only a few generations had lived before them. And from these 3 major nodes emit dozens of mitochondrial DNA variants, each at a relatively greater distance than the 3 major haplogroups. Obviously, since Babel, there have been many generations accounting for the relatively larger distances between the dozens of mitochondrial variants we see today and the 3 major haplogroups from which they emerge. This is incredible and irrefutable. In a nutshell, looking here at the graph, short lines equal pre-flood times, long lines equal post-flood times. What about the subnodes? Well, this model makes testable predictions. That's the gold standard of science. If we come from these 3 nodes and the DNA differences are all a marker of time, what we are looking at here with the radiating out from the 3 nodes are post-flood times or the history of civilization. We should be able to read the history of civilization from this tree. Romans, Greeks, Persians, tips are individuals. Amazing work is actually currently being done on the transatlantic slave trade. Also, testable predictions have been made on the most divergent of African peoples, the Khoisan peoples. This is being made by creationists. Can evolutionists make testable predictions on this map of humanity or just scoff? Now, evolutionist objections that I've seen, evolutionists will complain about where the actual tree is rooted. The tree is rooted on the L node. Evolutionists look at the data with their bias. Now, these criticizers, see if they'll give any justification for where they root their tree. Testable predictions, as I've shown and presented, flow from the placement of the root. Specifically, with respect to the mitochondrial DNA mutation rate in Africans. Where are the predictions from evolutionists? It comes down to the science. You have to pick a root and see if the predictions that flow from this choice actually work. Evolutionists, on the other hand, pick a point somewhere in the middle of the L root. Creationists have chosen the base of the L root as one of the wives of Noah's sons, with the bases of M and N as the wives of the other 2 sons. The rooting works because it leads to accurate predictions, and that's what empirical science is all about, and retrodictions, about the rate which mitochondrial DNA mutates. The evolutionists pick their root because this is where chimpanzee branches off. It's important to be able to articulate your opponent's position accurately. Their choice, though, is driven by the assumption of human-ape common ancestry, so they can't use their root choice to argue against that of the creationists. Now, if we look at DNA, we now know that junk DNA, the non-coding regions of DNA, function much like the operating system in a computer that is directing the timing, expression, and regulation and use of the other information or the data files that code for proteins. We know these regions regulate DNA replication, transcription, mark sites for program rearrangements of genetic material, controls RNA processing, editing, and splicing, and repairs DNA. It even regulates embryological and placental development, and even aids in immunodefense. This is just a tiny fraction of what these DNA regions actually do. The fact of multiple overlapping codes make our information systems both polyfunctional and polyconstrained, which is yet another major fatal blow to evolutionary theory. We are dealing here with a highly compressed DNA code beyond the best computer code. We write books. We don't write books that can be read both forwards and backwards. To bring this statement here about junk DNA to a conclusion, this evidence of functionality will distinguish between the two models, evolution versus creation, being discussed. For the evolution model, all differences in nuclear DNA are due to mutations. And in the creation model, differences in mitochondrial DNA sequences are due to design and mutations. When comparing DNA sequences in similar genes in different families, evolution says all differences are due to mutations, while creation says the differences were designed with distinct functionality. And this prediction involving the non-coding DNA regions, evolution says there will be much non-functionality, maybe 20%, while creation predicts functionality for most of the genome. And results from ENCODE project have suggested that at least 80% of the human genome is functional. These results are preliminary, but the trajectory is clear. Most non-coding DNA in the human genome is functional and serves in a regulatory capacity, especially since portions of the genome involved specifically in embryological development were not evaluated. However, systematic knockout experiments can only fully demonstrate this. Junk DNA is dead. Richard Dawkins, in his book in 2009, said it is a remarkable fact that the greater part, 95% in the case of humans, of the genome might as well not be there for all the difference it makes. After Richard Dawkins realized junk DNA is dead based on ENCODE, in a debate, Dawkins stated, "I know there are some creationists who have jumped on it, junk DNA that is, because they think it is awkward for Darwinism. Quite the contrary, of course. It is exactly what a Darwinist would hope for, to find usefulness in a living world." So you can see him changing his mind there in light of the new evidence. The junk DNA and how long?
Minute and a half left.
Well, are going the way of the vestigial organs. They cannot be called upon to support common descent. Now, convergent evolution, big rescue device for the phylogenetic trees, which we can get into a little bit, nested hierarchies. Homology, let's look at sedans, for example, that are made and manufactured in not only Asia, but also North America and Europe. They all share a common set of features. Even though there is a vast geographical separation from the manufacturing locations of Honda, Chevy, Mercedes, they all have four wheels, doors on the side, windshields in the front, brake lights in the back, and a wide variety of other shared characteristics. Is this reason for similarity due to common ancestry? We know that the reason for this similarity is actually because cars were designed for similar functions. Created heterozygosity hypothesis explains the rapid speciation after the flood and after creation, because if you have heterozygous ancestors, an almost limitless variety of combinations of chromosomes, genes, and traits are possible. Evolution, we're talking about evolution here. It means a change in allele frequency in populations over time. It all comes down to whether or not there's a limit, whether or not there's a barrier. How much time, James?
You got about 10 seconds.
So he talked a lot about genomic degradation. I'm going to save that for my rebuttal period. Thanks so much, James. I'm good to go.
You bet. All right, so just in time. And next, if you want to, once you switch out of full screen, we'll switch back over to the dialog box, Standing for Truth. And with that, very excited to move on to the rebuttal stage. So for the rebuttal stage, that's actually just going to include 10 minutes instead of 12. So we're just a little bit less. And so for the rebuttal stage, very excited to move into what you might call the interactive part, and then eventually to the cross-examination, which I am especially stoked about. So setting the timer for 10 minutes for you, Godless Galaxy. And when you're ready, the floor is yours. I'll start on your first word.
Can you explain entirely what I can do with my rebuttal? Is it possible I could ask some questions or specific about something, or do I just?
You could definitely ask questions that you want to for sure have answered. It's and then during the cross-examination, you could ask the questions where Standing for Truth will actually have a chance to respond. But for the next 10 minutes, and I haven't started the clock yet, that'll be just purely your time where he won't be responding. So sorry if I mentioned the cross-examination, I got excited. I jumped the gun. So this part will just be the rebuttal where you'll get your 10 minutes to respond to what he just said.
All right. I saw a scientific paper on the testing of the genome of a 5,300-year-old man. I forget exactly where it was found, but what they found in his genome, or mitochondrial DNA and stuff, was that his mitochondrial DNA was not been able to found, probably due to not that many samples. But they did find the Y chromosome around that area with many descendants. So I don't know exactly how the sex chromosomes and how they work entirely, but I would question how the Y chromosome could show up in an area, show up before the flood, and still have the same sex chromosome around the same area. So this man died around this area, and he still has descendants around this area. If the flood was true, then he wouldn't have any descendants around that area because he was before the flood, according to the creationist model. So it was an interesting thing I found online. He was talking about junk DNA and how we are now changing our opinion on what it is, and that's how science works. We change our opinion based on the evidence. It's no surprise we would change our opinion based on the evidence that has been provided. Creationists sometimes don't accept some of the evidence we have, but we will change our opinion if they can provide empirical evidence. I'm questioning exactly what sources Standing for Truth used exactly for the predictions on saying that the variance between mitochondria DNA or whatever was 28,000 and they predicted about 1,000. I haven't entirely researched into that, but it would be nice if you could send me a source for that. He talked about how we only have 3 mitochondria haplogroups exactly. I would wonder exactly what the time scale would be between each one and exactly how they are different. And genetic, I forget the name for it. It's something, basically, I think it's genetic bottleneck, probably. But basically, with heterozygous to whatever organisms or humans, when they start inbreeding, it starts to decline due to the fact that mutations still occur, and as he has stated, we have mutations that are still bad and cannot be weeded out from natural selection because they appear too fast and can't be counted by beneficial mutations. So I'm wondering on how we're still here if heterosity would have decreased, and due to inbreeding, we would have eventually, I would think, have a lot more genetic diseases than we do now. I'll probably just wait for this rebuttal about what I said for what, how much time I have left?
You got about, switching over, 6 minutes left.
Okay. I'm not entirely well known on genetics. I kind of did a good amount of research into genetic entropy, which he didn't entirely talk about, but that doesn't entirely matter, I guess. He stated that we would that they make accurate predictions about genetics, in which I don't know entirely if that's true. If they have predictions, I wouldn't know about anyone else about evolution if they've made predictions. But evolution is a theory because it's been able to make accurate predictions. Now, of course, Dalton didn't know genetics, so he couldn't make predictions about genetics. But with other evidence other than genetics, it's quite clear that Darwin's predictions came quite true. And so that I don't have much to go on because I don't know much about what he said. I understood what he said, but I don't know anything to respond with. I guess that's my time. I just keep adding time to the questions instead of the think, which I guess is not that time. I'm done, James. I don't have much to say. Yes,
All right, now we are going to transition into standing for truth's rebuttal. So, in just a second, I will start a timer at your first word. Am I being heard?
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, I can start my rebuttal whenever you're ready.
All right, I can start at your first word.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thanks, Godless Galaxy. I've got a bunch of stuff written down from your opening. In regards to, let me see, dinosaurs here, the flood, a lot about the fossil record. Dinosaurs were large and live on lower elevations. So larger creatures at lower elevations will be buried first during the flood, because according to the Bible, it states that there's higher elevations with 4 rivers where humans and other animals live. Also, the flood buried not simple to complex, rather by ecosystems. This is according to the catastrophic plate tectonic model, or where the animals actually live. Burial started with shallow marine creatures, then later on land creatures. And that's what we actually find in the rock record. And the Bible did say that the flood started in the ocean, so it's no surprise that marine fossils are actually buried first. And many evolutionists actually concluded many rock layers were formed rapidly from catastrophism because there are almost no evidence of erosion in between every rock layer in the geologic column. So they deny this, though, that it was as big as the global flood given their own data. If the rock layers were formed rapidly, the same fossils within the rocks formed rapidly also, not by slow and gradual uniformitarianism as evolutionists say. So evolutionists actually contradict themselves. And there is plenty of evidence that the earth was once underwater. I mean, there are marine fossils on mountains and in landlocked areas far from the sea. Some sedimentary rock layers extend over entire continents or even farther. The deposition of those layers must have been catastrophic, or there would not have been much fossilization. A few examples are fossils of animals giving birth, fish being eaten. This suggests sudden and rapid burial. And if we want to see a real-time event that can give us a good impression of what the global flood would have been like, the eruption at Mount St. Helens demonstrated that sedimentary layers hundreds of feet thick could be laid down in hours to days, that canyons can be formed rapidly, and how multiple fossilized forests could actually form as a result of a single volcanic eruption, and possibly even how coal seams could be produced quickly. So there's plenty of evidence for the global flood. And the thing is, what we actually see, and some of this is what he was talking about in the notes I was leaving, is that the vast majority of the fossils from top to bottom are marine fossils. 98% of the fossils of these marine fossils are mixed with land fossils. We find clams mixed with birds, mixed with horses, in all different strata. So the vast majority of fossils in the record are marine. We see evidence of animals running from the floodwaters. We find animal tracks before we actually find the actual animals. This is hard enough for the evolutionists to explain. He also talked about genetic entropy and how he only says that it pertains to humans, and if he's seen it in other things. Well, we actually see in regards to humans that there is a pandemic, entropic degeneration on all levels. We see Alzheimer's, dementia, autism, asthma, autoimmune diseases, cancers. In regards to animals, we see mammoth populations. They were highly inbred and carried an elevated genetic load. Lenski, who was attempting to demonstrate evolution, he actually demonstrated biblical creation. He demonstrated genetic decay because what was seen in his bacterial experiments was reductive evolution. All beneficial mutations have been seen to be reductive, loss of function, loss of promoter, loss of genes. And what these bacteria are doing are painting themselves into a corner. They're handicapped, they're lazy, they're weak. They're getting rid of genes short term, but it's long term degeneration. So Lenski's own data in regards to the bacteria is actually revealing a clear trajectory for genetic degeneration. These adaptations, because there were adaptations seen, I don't want to strawman the evolutionists, but they were largely accomplished by means of loss of function and loss of regulation mutations. It's a net loss of information. We also see it in viruses. H1N1 human version went from a red hot pandemic to a whimper to an extinction event in 90 years. Genetic entropy in real time. Now, in regards to the beneficial mutations, you're going to have to explain how this accumulation of near neutral and deleterious mutations, how natural selection is going to be able to stop it, because natural selection can neither recognize it, it can't act upon it. And due to the influx of deleterious mutations, the rare occurrence of beneficial mutations cannot compensate for the actual information loss. And linkage groups, for example, they can only get worse and not better, because mutations in linkage groups are linked basically forever. That means if you have lots of bad mutations, say in that linkage group, and then that linkage group is reducing in fitness continuously based on these accumulated deleterious mutations that I'm talking about, say you throw in 1 or 2 beneficials, they're just going to get neutralized by the large numbers of deleterious mutations. And evolutionists have come up with some rescue devices, for example, synergistic epistasis, mutation count mechanism. I'm not sure if he's aware of them, but if he's done his research, he should certainly see that these are the big rescue devices. They've both been falsified. It can't be stopped, which means if you look to, say, phylogenetics, the fossil record, it's based on a primary assumption that molecules to man evolution is true, but based on genetic data, we know it's not true. So it's based on a false assumption. How much time do I have?
You have 3 minutes.
I'd also like to see an example of, because it all comes down to net loss versus net gain. And I'd like to see an example of a beneficial mutation that actually adds new, novel, and meaningful information to the genome, because everything I've seen has been decay of prior information, whether it's sickle cell anemia, melano mutation, nylon digestion by bacteria, E. coli experiment by Lenski, and gene duplications. I think he mentioned that here. If gene duplications are almost universally deleterious, and a few rare beneficial duplications cannot offset the many accumulating deleterious duplications, let alone all the other accumulating mutations. And if I give you a copy of a book that you already own, there's no new, novel, meaningful information there. And if I start putting in typographical errors in that second copy of the original book, all you have is a degraded, messed up copy of the original book. So it all comes down to net loss versus net gain. And I'm going to have to see where those beneficial mutations that are actually adding new, novel information to the genome are coming from. So hopefully he can answer that question. But the most important thing about genetic entropy is the fact that it's consistent with a biblical-based model, because we know, according to the Bible, it records a time when people had extremely long lives. And when the lifespan of early biblical characters and their ages are actually compared, what's astounding is that the biblical data clearly reveals an exponential decay curve. And this curve can only be described as biological. That means, based on the data, it pretty much has to be concluded that the authors of Genesis either faithfully recorded an exponential decay of human lifespans, or they collaborated in fabricating the data using sophisticated mathematical modeling. Now, to actually fabricate this data, though, would have required an advanced knowledge of mathematics, as well as a strong incentive to show exponential decay curves. So that seems nonsensical and illogical, to attribute this data to some elaborate fraud thousands of years ago. The most rational, logical conclusion is that the data is real. And human life expectancy was once hundreds of years, but has progressively declined to current values. So the explanation, given the empirical data on genomic degeneration and the biblical text, is certainly consistent. So I think it comes down to, as I've said, net gain versus net loss. Beneficial mutations, they cannot keep up with deleterious mutations. I want to see how he can solve this problem. Deleterious mutations are pouring in faster than they can be removed. He talked about also junk DNA a little bit, and how Richard Dawkins quote, he's just changing his mind based on the new data. But the whole point is that based on the trajectory of genome-wide functionality, it's consistent with our model of pre-existing heterozygosity, because if God created Adam and Eve and all the created kinds with this created heterozygosity, this potential for genetic diversification, we'd expect most of our genome to be functional to some extent. So that's consistent with our model and confirmed prediction of our model. L, M, and N point directly to Noah's three daughters-in-law.
Standing for truth, you have about 10 seconds left, so...
I think I see everything. I got my notes here. I think I covered everything. So I'm happy to end it here. Thanks so much.
All right. And now we will transition into the cross-examination, which will be 10 minutes, and it will start with Godless Galaxy whenever you're ready.
All right. Do you have any other examples of genomes like us? You said mammoth, but is there any other genomes?
So for genetic entropy?
Yes.
Yeah, the examples I gave, for example, was bacteria. So we see Lenski's E. coli experiment. He was looking to demonstrate the fish-to-fisherman evolution, adaptive gains, but we actually seen in that reductive evolution. Also, the H1N1 virus, we see that there's a linear accumulation of mutations that led to the extinction in 90 years, as well as Neanderthal. So there's more, we see data that they were highly inbred. They had very high genetic load. I don't know if you're familiar with Homo naledi, Homo erectus. They were also both highly inbred and suffered also from reductive evolution. The mammoth populations, as you just talked about, yes, they carried an elevated genetic load. And in the human population today, a lot of it is epigenetic degeneration, but we see entropic degeneration on all levels, as I said before: Alzheimer's, cancers, asthma, autism, autoimmune diseases. So we see this genome-wide degradation in everything: viruses, humans, animals, bacteria. Does that answer your question?
Is there any other living animals that we can check their genome and show that they are also declining like us, living? I know you list viruses, but animals like giraffes or something.
I think we can see it. I think there's cheetah populations and dog populations. I mean, a lot of the changes, for example, if we look to our model of created heterozygosity, a lot of the changes we'd expect to be due to a loss of information, just like Lenski revealed himself. So even if you look at, say, domestic dogs, going from, say, a wolf over time to something like a Chihuahua, that's the degradation of information. So the allelic diversity and the allelic potential in something like a Chihuahua versus something even like a Great Dane, it's been due to a loss of information. So in a way, that would be information loss as well, consistent with genetic entropy. I think everything we see can point us back to a time of least genetic entropy, which would be a time of creation. Points us right back to what Genesis says is God creating everything perfect. Does that answer your question?
You just listed 2 animals that have been affected by humans, which is the reason why they're suffering. Because humans have hunted down cheetahs to the point where they're suffering from a bottleneck, And dogs, for most of dogs, it's because of humans' artificial selection.
Do you
So-
have? So, are you saying because of the population bottlenecks, or say the inbreeding? Because inbreeding reveals, our genetic mistakes within the genome. So inbreeding, because I'll present a lot of evidence of genomic degradation, and they'll say, well, of course that's expected based on population bottlenecks, inbreeding, but inbreeding is like a sneak preview of where we're actually going genetically as species. So I think inbreeding is in population bottlenecks and the genetic degradation we see in those examples is certainly consistent with genetic entropy, as it is a sneak preview of where we're heading.
Right. You mentioned the heterogenesis of Adam and Eve and Noah. Would they be the same? Like, would they be the same level of heterogeneity or whatever?
Well, Adam and Eve would have been created with, because I always ask people, do you think God's command, be fruitful and multiply, was meant to be called out through cloning? So most people, 99% of people say, no, of course not. That's a weird question. So that was an indirect admission to the created heterozygosity model, because God would have created pre-existing DNA differences in the genomes of Adam and Eve. So through processes like recombination, gene conversion, and slightly due to mutations, the variation in genetic diversity would be quick and would be rapid. But of course, the decrease of heterozygosity, for example, speciation would have been a lot more common and quick, say in pre-flood days, because there has been a decrease in heterozygosity. And a lot of times speciation is due to shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity. So I think speciation events are going to be less common today versus, say, thousands of years ago. So yes, the answer would be increased levels of heterozygosity in Noah and in Adam and Eve.
So wouldn't we expect the same rate of degradation?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Wouldn't their heterozygosity, whatever, be the same decrease rate? So there wouldn't be a giant drop exactly in the age after Noah's flood.
Well, the created heterozygosity was at the base level. So chromosomes, head-to-head comparison has different DNA letters on each pair. So that would lead to the diversification. But in regards to decreased levels of heterozygosity, as you're talking about, and say mutations, genetic entropy would have led to decreased lifespans based on the accumulation of mutations and based on even decreased levels of heterozygosity, even though I think that has more to do with genetic diversity, but also the environmental conditions pre-flood versus post-flood. So a lot of the environmental changes based on the effects from the flood, I believe that too would have contributed to the decline in ages, because we see that in the biblical text. We see immediately post-flood, we see that, and we also see based on the accumulation of mutations that in the Levitical law is when Moses actually commanded and declared that, marrying close relatives would be against the law, because at the end of the day, we know that a big reason for that as well, other than being obviously immoral, would be the fact that those genetic mistakes could lead to diseases, obviously, like Down syndrome and whatnot. So we can see that post-flood as well. We can see that evidence there.
All right. You, in your rebuttal, you didn't really address any two points that I would have liked you to. But how would you account for the fact that we have silent genes in boars for teeth, and that we have activated them, and it has shown that they can form teeth?
So are you saying that these are genes in You're saying they're silent genes? Are they non-coding genes that you're saying don't have a function that were shown to have function? Pardon?
They were like turned off, I think, exactly.
Actually, can you repeat that a little bit louder?
The genes were turned off, so the genes to create the teeth were turned off.
You're saying that the genes were so not mutated, but they were kind of like because I know recessive genes on teeth, according to our model, would be part of the created heterozygosity. So I don't think that that's evidence either way. You know what I mean? When there's a competing explanation, that's why I gave the testable falsifiable predictions, because that's what would declare a more superior model. So are you saying it was a gene knockout which revealed this outcome that you're talking about? It was a gene knockout?
Can I just interject for a second and remind y'all that we have about 1 minute left for this portion?
Yes, thank you.
Basically, what I'm wondering is, why do birds have the genes to create teeth? That's my entire point, basically.
Okay. So you're saying that the gene to create teeth it's like a pseudo gene. So it's not. It's kind of like the gulo vitamin C gene. Because
I don't know that.
Because I think a lot of it, because, for example, you're assuming obviously mutations are the source of all variety. So I think with what you're talking about could be interpretation of the data based on the assumption, because we know that a lot of these genetic mistakes, recessive genes, pseudo genes, are actually now known to be functional DNA differences. So if it's a broken gene or if it's a silent gene, based on, say, ENCODE and what we know about the trajectory for genome-wide functionality, I'm not sure if if I'm answering your question properly. And I know, like, Mendel's pea plants, if you look at Mendel, who did the experiments on recessive traits, it can also be applied to teeth. So, I mean, I'm not sure if I'm misunderstanding the question. I don't see it being a problem. I see it fitting quite nicely in with our model of created genetic diversity and heterozygosity.
My time's probably almost done. But why would God even put genetic information to create teeth, but have it be useless or recessive or whatever? Why would he do that in birds?
Well, the thing is, we don't necessarily know if it is useless. Like, for example, they used to say that humans possess the broken remnants of an ancient chicken gene, but now we know after further genetic data that no actual remnant exists. This fragment actually is now known to be a functional DNA element. So what you're seeing here, if it is a pseudo gene, with further research, or maybe it's even known now, it could be a functional DNA element, because we see now that 80% of our genome is transcribed, suggesting function, and a lot of these pseudo genes are being overturned. Of course, there are actual genes that are broken. You know what I mean? I had a Honda Civic and a Chevy Cruze, and the air conditioner broke in both the exact same spot. So that doesn't prove that they're related through common ancestry to a skateboard. It just.
All right, we are actually out of time for this portion, so we are going to switch, and Standing for Truth can cross-examine Godless Galaxy. And we'll start when you're ready.
Okay, awesome. I think, in regards to, because I know you talked about genetic entropy, I know it comes down to net loss versus net gains. Usually they'll resort to beneficial mutations can outweigh the deleterious mutations, but if we know that the rare occurrence of beneficial mutations cannot compensate for the information loss based on numerical simulations, based on the empirical evidence, what would be your one or two best examples of beneficial mutations that actually add new novel information to the genome? Go ahead.
I haven't entirely researched into beneficial mutations, which I can do later. But I probably always tell you these. But most of the mutations, I would agree that beneficial mutations can get rid of old mutations, like lactose intolerant got rid of some genes. But you also got to realize that sometimes losing a function and gaining a new function can be gain than loss. So if a beneficial mutation outweighs the cost of losing that one function, it would be much better.
So, like for example, the adult lactose tolerance, if that's what you're talking about, from my understanding, it's due to a broken lactase promoter. So my question would be, if a lot of these examples of, say, beneficial mutations, because a lot of the mutations, if they're beneficial, a lot of them are environmentally dependent. If they're decay of prior information, loss of information, how is that going to compensate for the influx of deleterious mutations? Because if it's all about net gain versus net loss, how is that problem of genomic degradation going to be solved?
I haven't really researched genetic hitchhiking, but it is a selection that does happen. Basically, a group of mutations, a mutation would have like a group of mutations with it. I don't know entire specifics about it, but basically it would all be focused on mutations, which would increase the frequency of those genes around that one mutation that caused this, and the frequency would increase, and then those genes could possibly mutate more. I don't know the whole entire thing about hitchhiking, but that's what I've learned so far.
No problem. If because it seems like you're in agreement that a lot of what we thought of to be junk DNA is now showing to be functional, or is at least not idle in the genome. If the ENCODE project actually now shows that, say, most nucleotides play a role in multiple overlapping codes, wouldn't that make these beneficial mutations that we're talking about, that are actually not deleterious, to be at some level vanishingly rare? Because if more of our genome is functional, that means a mistake or a mutation on a functional gene. Wouldn't that just increase the level of degradation? Go ahead.
If we do figure out that the whole entire genome, or most of it, is functional, it's possible, yes, it's possible that these mutations could be deleterious or whatever, but it's also possible that some of these genes can mutate, or they can mutate, or they could, they can create a copy of themselves, and that function will still exist, and that the other copy gene can do whatever it wants, which could either increase or decrease the function. So if we do figure that out, it's possible that genes copying themselves or whatever could show that not every mutation causes a loss of function.
Okay, thanks for that. I think also because you talked about some of the flood evidence, the fossil record, because the paleocurrent data from the Mesozoic and Paleozoic rocks, they actually indicate a pattern of cross beds and ripple marks that actually flow the span of entire continents in one direction during the Mesozoic, and a completely different direction during the Paleozoic. So my question in regards to that would be, if there was no global flood, so does it seem like you were fighting that in your opening, the currents of ripple marks and cross beds should be randomly distributed, flowing from all directions. So how come that's not the case? Given a uniformitarian assumption, how come that wouldn't be the case?
Is this ripple effect like seen across the entire world? Like every single Mesozoic layer has this ripple effect. Is that true?
Yes, we see this pattern of ripple marks, and they're flowing the span of entire continents in one direction during the Mesozoic, and a completely different direction during the Paleozoic. So I mean, it seems consistent with a global model, but I'm not too sure how someone under a uniformitarian assumption would be able to explain a lot of the geology we see.
Well, I'm not an expert at anything. I have a little bit of everything. I'm not completely. I don't know about these ripple effects in these layers, but if a good amount of layers show this ripple effect, like 90% or whatever, I'm not gonna say 90%, but like whatever you classify as pre-flood has all these ripple effects, and you can prove that these are different, then I don't know exactly how I can account for the geography of the continents and their. I'm not an expert at geography. But,
Yeah, no problem. Since we're still on the flood and the CPT model is what I look to, how could the weak and more so snail pace, say, plate tectonics that uniformitarians look to, how could they have sent cool slabs of rock towards the mantle, or I should say the core boundary? Because it seems like only a strong force like the biblical floods catastrophic plate tectonics model could have actually accomplished that. Because we look to rapid plate tectonics, and that seems to explain the observation. So how does slow and steady plate tectonics explain that?
I mean, it is slow, but it is devastating. The damage a plate could do when it slides under another plate, it causes earthquakes, or when a lot of damage can happen. It's possible because the mantle is much, or the core is much hotter and liquefied. It's not as dense. The crust is possibly more able to go under it. And this is, I don't know how heavy these plates are, but probably tons and tons of weight is going into this effort into the core, which could push away this molten rock or whatever it's in.
Okay, and thanks for that. I guess, given all the evidence that I provided about, the Earth once being underwater, for example, a lot of these fossils that we see of, say, animals giving birth, fish being eaten, suggesting sudden and rapid burial, is that not consistent within a biblical-based model of a global flood? And if not, how does, somebody under a uniformitarian-based assumption explain this current data?
Got about a minute left. Oh, sorry, Sid.
I would say it works for either model. If fish is eating another fish or something, as rapid disaster can happen anywhere on this planet because there's thousands of volcanoes and who knows how many underground ocean volcanoes or whatever is in the deep could fossilize these animals quickly enough so that they eat. What I don't understand is that we don't find any like dinosaurs eating humans or something, or like they're in the stomach, or some sort of animal we would find at the top layers in the stomach of some other animal below it.
So based on what I said about the distribution of 10 seconds?
Yep.
Okay, I'm good then. I don't think I can formulate another question than that. Thanks.
You got it. Thank you, gentlemen. And by the way, everybody, we will hopefully have these debaters back. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see them again, as we are hopefully going to have them come back to Modern Day Debate to debate again. And also, we have a lot of debates lined up. Tomorrow we have 3 debates, which is insane. So it's going to be a lot of fun, a lot of different topics tomorrow, a variety, all of which are different from today's topics. So a lot of new stuff. And with that, I am now setting the timer for the closing. So I am still scanning for questions for the Q&A. Got a good list going, and the Q&A intake will be open just a few more minutes longer. and then then we will actually be closing it for the intake. So, closing statement, I am starting the clock for 5 minutes, and Godless Galaxy started, so we will let Godless Galaxy start the closing statements, and I'll start that on your first word.
Thank you, Truth for Sending, for having me, I guess, whatever. My closing statement, I don't know entirely what to put in it. I wish this went a little bit better, but this went good, I guess. One of my questions about the silent gene with the teeth and forwards might have been a little bit confusing. I can understand that, but I tried to explain that, but you kept going off on about how it's consistent with kinetic entropy. But I was trying to, and you were trying to say it was some sort of, even though in my opening statement I clarified that we were able to add mice gene to activate this, showing that this gene in the boards was silent, or whatever you may call it, which it did not have a function. And when we had the gene, it did have a function, and that was creating teeth in the boards. I would have liked if you talked about how my rebuttal, I talked about the 5,400-year-old man and how his chromosomes were found around his area, and how that lines up with the biblical flood, even though his Y chromosome's found, but its mitochondria has not been found around there. And you kept asking me about geography and the flood exactly. You didn't really you talked about how I said like simple to complex or whatever, but I mentioned how we see in a fossil record where we see simple line, single celled to fish, and we see the separation between fish and with land walking animals, and then we see the separation of reptiles and amphibians, and then reptiles and mammals, or whatever. You didn't entirely address that point, I guess. How much time do I have left?
You've got 2 minutes and 45 seconds.
Alright. Better examples I would stop for genetic entropy. You gave me these examples of showing the ones that have died out because of inbreeding and other ones. You said sheep and dogs, which those have been clearly altered by humans, which I wish you gave me an example of one so I could see. That's, I guess, that's the end of my closing. I don't know entirely how to do my closing.
You got it. Well, I think I think you did well. Like basically just summarizing your main points. So very clear, and then not introducing new information. So you did well. So like that's what you're supposed to do, and you did it. So if you do have maybe about 1:45 left, again that's optional. Like if you feel like you're set, then you can wrap it up.
I'm set. I'm good.
You got it. All right. Well, thank you very much, Godless Galaxy. And then we are going to go to Standing for Truth. We are going to reset the clock, and I will start on your first word. Oh, that's right. I muted you because you were stamping envelopes. There we go. Unmute.
Well, thank you. I think if we look to some of the things he was saying, say the mammal-like reptiles progressing to mammals. I mean, this alleged succession of mammal-like reptiles towards ever more, mammalness is actually not found in any one location on Earth. It's inferred, and through the correlation of fossiliferous beds from different continents, judgments and guesses are made. So it's kind of circular. And cladistics, for example, it doesn't actually demonstrate evolution, because Cladistics is really just a classification scheme, nothing more. And if we look to genetics and we see that based on information loss, based on genomic degradation, that means that primary assumption of molecules to man evolution obviously can't be true. So at the end of the day, fossils are fickle, they are fragmentary and open to contradictory interpretation. So we need to look at the observational data, and when we look at these phylogenetic systematics, a lot of time they invoke the rescue device of convergent evolution, and that means that a lack of uniqueness of the phylogenetic tree is usually just explained away by this convergent evolution. And all that really is it's the appearance of the same trait or character in independent lines. So it's actually just an invention. And for example, whales, dolphins, and bats are the only mammals that actually have echolocation systems. And on the basis of gross anatomy, the whales and dolphins are classified closer to the cow and other ruminants than to the bats. But on the basis of their echolocation systems, they should actually belong with bats. Also, molecular data of a certain protein actually puts whales and dolphins squarely with the bats. So at the end of the day, a lot of the data strongly suggests that the phylogenies that they're building and the phylogenetic tree does not actually represent objective reality and actually does falsify universal common descent. In my presentation, I put forth testable and falsifiable predictions based on mitochondrial DNA mutation rates, based on pre-existing heterozygosity, based on the known mitochondrial mutation rates. The DNA differences are reconciled perfectly under a biblical-based model, while the evolutionists, on the other hand, have over-predicted one and have under-predicted another. Dinosaurs not found with humans is pretty simple. It's because they weren't buried together, as well as when we were talking about the plate tectonics. Standard plate tectonics is slow and gradual, which means it wouldn't be strong enough to actually create most features in geology today. For example, the Himalayas. So at the end of the day, that answer isn't going to work. And in regards to genetic entropy, the claimed rescue devices of, say, beneficial mutations, natural selection, it's just not going to work because of what we know about the transmitted mutations, 100 per person per generation. I mean, take a room full of people. You can kill off the most mutant people. That means we now have a room half full of people who still have 60 to 100 more mutations than their parents. So that means if everybody is multiply mutant, and if every generation is more mutant than the one before it, all selection can actually do is slow down the degeneration by killing off the absolute worst of the lot. But it doesn't stop mutations from accumulating in the population over time. Things are going down, not up. So it seems pretty evident, at least to me, that all modern scientific evidence points to the decay and destruction of a originally perfect design and creation. So that's consistent with a biblical-based model. The biblical-based model under the created heterozygosity hypotheses makes testable and falsifiable predictions. Junk DNA is junk science. We now know that there's a strong trajectory for genome-wide functionality. These pseudo genes, for example, that he was talking about, a broken gene. I think it was
time. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
So we are going to now move into the Q&A, and we are very excited about that. So for this Q&A, we are going to switch off reading questions. So I will read the first one, and then Siv will be reading every other one. So first, we have to say thank you for your questions. Really interesting one. So we have Dalek Sek asks, for standing for truth, why can't creationists go to the scientific community and demonstrate their case?
Well, the thing is, a lot of this data that I'm providing here in regards to the LMN groups, also the slide that I presented that I titled "Too Close for Comfort for Evolutionists." The genetic data is not disputed by the evolutionists, and a lot of it comes down to a worldview. But based on the predictions that we're making, it's confirming a biblical-based model. And at the end of the day, a lot of creationists are writing peer-reviewed articles that are. You can even look at the intelligent design movement that are coming out with a lot of work. And at the end of the day, it comes down to a worldview issue. But you know what? If the gold standard of science is being testable and falsifiable, I haven't seen any rebuttal or anything against the prediction here that I presented, and the data is widely known and accepted by evolutionists. We're just using that data to show why biblical creation is consistent.
All right, and our next question is from Landon Freeman. It's a question for Godless. What evidence would convince you that the creationist interpretation of speciation and kinds is correct, or at the very least likely?
Repeat that. You kind of lagged for me.
All right, would you just like me to repeat that?
Yeah.
Okay, I read that kind of fast. What evidence would convince you that the creationist interpretation of speciation and kinds is correct, or at the very least likely?
For kinds to be correct, for some reason we would somehow, I don't know exactly what the best evidence would be, that would convince me. I'm trying to think out about this one. But if they could somehow show me like an animal that can't be classified by biogenetics or a classification system, so like it doesn't follow under like Eukaryo or any other kind of classification we have for animals, I guess that would convince me.
Gotcha. So thank you for that. And next we have from Jeremy Ike 1944. Ask Godless Galaxy, how are genes learned to highly regulate and highly targeted response to certain needs from the body? I think that I maybe read that wrong. So it's ask Godless Galaxy, how are genes learned to highly regulate and highly target response to certain needs from the body? Maybe just not quite sure what they meant. If somebody else knows what that is supposed to mean.
I think they're asking basically how do genes control the body and how does it like self-control itself.
Okay, thanks for thank you.
Genes, how they regulate themselves, I guess, would be that they create, I don't know the entire way they regulate themselves, but I would think that they create protein which does regulate themselves. I don't know entirely the entire process, but and then saying how it controls keeps control of the body. Basically, DNA is a plan or a building plan, I guess, on how to build humans, and then also it is a plan for how to keep everything oriented, which is how I think enzymes and cells and a lot of other genetic stuff come into play on how the body works. It's all based on genes, of course. But yeah.
You bet. Thank you.
All right, our next question is from Rayward. Given the flood would have removed all the pre-flood created diversity through a catastrophic genetic bottleneck, how did the allelic diversity recover to get new species so fast? I suspect this is for standing for truth.
Sorry. Okay. Ready, standing for truth.
No problem. Well, according to our model, in regards to created heterozygosity, we actually define an allele. Because if you define allele in the terms of, say, a gene unit, then yes, generating allelic diversity, say by mutating just one gene per mutational event, that would produce little diversity. But we actually define an allele as a single genomic position that's actually independent of its relationship to a gene. So that's pretty obvious, that enormous allelic diversity can actually be generated by mutation. But as I said earlier in my presentation and in the cross-examination, this allelic diversity doesn't need to just arise through mutation, because if we're using this genomic position definition of an allele, other mechanisms, right, besides mutation will generate allelic diversity. For example, a single gene typically spans thousands of nucleotides. So with gene conversion, recombination, and these single nucleotide variants, they're distributed throughout the gene. If we allow for this genomic position definition, that means every one of those SNVs may have existed in a heterozygous state in each of the individuals of the pairs brought on board the ark. So that tremendous potential for allelic diversity wouldn't have been a problem for a flood bottleneck, because for one, the flood bottleneck would have been so short, and given the definition of an allele that we have in pre-existing DNA differences model, it would have been so short that very little genetic diversity would have been lost. Certainly also the after effects of the flood wouldn't have been a problem at all with that bottleneck. I hope that answers his question.
Thank you, Standing for Truth, and thank you for your question. So we will now go to the next question. This is from Dalek Sek, and this is for Standing for Truth. It is, why is the consensus among geologists that the worldwide flood did not happen?
Well, uniformitarianism, for example, is built under the assumption that obviously something like a global flood didn't happen. So I think the consensus certainly just comes down to a bias of the evidence if you're not going to look at the data under a biblical worldview, because obviously, as I explained earlier, there's plenty of evidence that the earth was once underwater. I mean, like these sedimentary rock layers really do extend over entire continents or even further. So the deposition of those layers must have been catastrophic, even in regards to fossilization. That couldn't have happened. So at the end of the day, my answer, a simple answer, is it just comes down to assumptions, uniformitarian related assumptions, and bias. So 2 Peter 3 says in the last days there's going to be scoffers walking after their own lust. They're going to be denying three things: the creation, the flood, and the second coming of Jesus Christ. So the fact that we're sitting here today arguing with atheists over those three exact same things is to me confirmed prophecy. And when I look at 2 Peter 3, I better look at the evidence and look for that indication of a global flood, and that's exactly what I see. So hope that answers the question.
You got it, Standing for Truth, and thank you, Dalek Sek, for your question. And the last question is from Miguel Gonzalez. So this is for the for Godless Galaxy. Miguel is asking, where does information come from?
Information come from. I would say information, if you're talking about genetics and stuff, that analogy, basically genetics and DNA, it's all chemicals. It's more of like an equation than information. As equations change with different variables, you get different outputs. So, and then how this arose, of course, would be ideogenesis or whatever, in which could be there's the RNA wall hypothesis or whatever that basically says that RNA could have possibly replicated itself repeatedly, which we have shown in the lab, could have eventually formed DNA. And of course, all this like AT, C, and G, all come from biochemicals that we have tested, and which have been tested in experiments showing that it's possible for DNA and RNA to be made in a lab.
You got it. Well, thank you very much, Godless Galaxy. And thank you, Miguel, for your question. So I am stoked. I appreciated everybody's efforts tonight. The audience asking your questions, thank you very much for being engaged. Thank you so much for Civ being here to help move this debate along, and also allowing me to step out of the room and taking full control. So also, more than anybody, I have to say to the debaters, thank you so much for the preparation you've done and getting in the hot seat. You really took on the brunt of it by far. So we just really appreciate you coming on and sharing your ideas, and hopefully the audience got to hear new ideas tonight. And I'm sure they did. So thank you very much, both for Godless Galaxy and Standing for Truth.
Well, thank you so much, James.
Thanks for having me, James.
My pleasure. And by the way, everybody, their links are down in the description, as well as Civcat. Her link is down in the description for her Twitter. So I totally encourage you, check their links out. And hey, what do you know? You might even make a friend. Even better. So we're glad you're here, regardless of your worldview. It's nice to have people who can still disagree. I mean, that's the thing. Don't fall off the wrong side of the horse saying, oh, well, it's like bad to debate, it's bad to disagree. It's like, no, like, don't freak out. Like, it's okay. You can be friends, and at the same time, like, don't think being friends means you can't disagree. It just means you disagree. Big deal. So, glad you were here, and we hope you have a great night. Again, 3 debates tomorrow. Holy smokes. Hope you tune into those and keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. If you'd like, hit that like button to help get this video spread more across YouTube so people can hear the different ideas from both of our debaters. So we hope you have a great night. Take care, everybody.